Well, kia ora koutou. Welcome, everyone. This is a late night panel for those of you who are in the Northern Hemisphere in the States. It's an early evening panel, let's say, for those of us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So my name's Dylan Horrocks, and I'm not really much of a game designer. I feel like a bit of an imposter here. I'm mostly known as a cartoonist, so I do graphic novels and comics. But I also have been playing role-playing games for 40 years and obsessed with them. And a lot of my recent work and the projects I'm working on at the moment are all about role-playing games, including designing a game. And I'm also teaching these days at Te Heninga Waka, the Wellington University, main Wellington University, Victoria University of Wellington. And a lot of my students are designing tabletop role-playing games. So I have a game design workshop group in amongst our postgraduate students, and there's some really interesting projects coming out of that. So I've kind of volunteered to moderate this panel, which is a session on the state of game design in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we have three fantastic panelists here, all of whom are game designers, much more than I am. And so I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and just say a little bit about what you've done, and feel free to mention any social media tags or websites where people can find your work. So let's start with Michael Sands.
Hi, yep, so I'm Michael Sands. I've also been playing role-playing games for about 40 years and totally obsessed with them. I'm probably mostly known for Monster of the Week, which is a game I designed about 12 years or so ago and has been pretty successful. I've done a number of other things as well, none of which have much got to many people, I think, but carrying on regardless, and indeed was involved in a lot of game design before that too, mainly for like local conventions and that sort of thing. So that's me.
And Jamie.
So I've been gaming since, so not quite as long because I'm younger than my big brother there, but he got me into it with RuneQuest and then White Wolf games. So that was probably 30-ish years. No, not quite 30 years. Anyway, so I've been gaming since then and designing stuff that kind of makes people think, especially about gender and gender roles in society. Also pretty big into the LARP scene, which is, we've got quite a lot of LARP in New Zealand. So a lot of the games that I've written are kind of parlor LARPs, so something you'd play in about 3 hours. And I'm also an author of other things that aren't role-playing games. Novels.
less interactive stories.
Slightly less, yes. Although I have been told off for keeping people up all night with them. So
great. And our third panelist is Cam Banks.
Hello. So yes, I want to throw a little difference in here, and that I have also been gaming for 40 years, and I'm also so I mean I don't want to surprise anybody, but that's the way things are with me too. My biggest difference is that I went and lived in the US for 22 years, and so I took off to get married to an American, and that was in the mid 90s. Came back at the end of 2018. I've been living back here home in Aotearoa since that point. The whole of my career pretty much started in the US, and so although I was gaming as a kid and we all played various things from D&D to Marvel superheroes and everything that was out at the time, when I had left, I had just come to a dead end at my job. I was a manager of Mark I Comics in Takapuna. Any of those of you who remember from years ago? And that wasn't going anywhere. That was pretty much a dead-end job because the store was going to close. And so I thought, well, I'll just bail and go get married and have a better life. So I did that for a while. Things rapidly became interesting when I was called on to help write some Dragonlance material for the 3rd edition D&D. I was designing games the whole time, but nothing really sort of was published. And that kind of took me off on a sort of a professional tangent. Now I am a creative director and design lead at Fandom Tabletop. They're the company that currently handles D&D Beyond, but they've also bought Lock, Stock, and Barrel, the Cortex system, which I helped to create the current version of, and they also brought me on, which was helpful because I was struggling with what to do next in New Zealand, and felt that was a wonderful outlet for my creative power there. So yeah, very, very pleased to be here, but I had this weird, strange FOMO sense of like not being here the whole time. So I'm going to be the somewhat outsider presence, even though I'm definitely Kiwi.
Well, I remember first meeting you years ago, Cam, when you were working at Mark One in Takapuna. So to me, it feels like you've been here all along, really.
Oh, well, I mean, you know. I took a detour, but you were still here, so it's fine.
Yeah. So our subject for this panel is a pretty broad one, really. The idea is to just look at what role-playing game design in Aotearoa is like as a whole, and we'll probably partly focus on the parts that each of you play in that. But I kind of want us to really look a bit at the whole broad landscape of the scene here and how that shapes the work that is produced here, the kind of games that are played and the kind of games that are created. And I wanted to start with each of you. I'm really putting you on the spot now, but I'm interested in each of you coming up with an answer to the question of what is the state of game design in Aotearoa in nothing more than a hashtag. So just give us a very short phrase, no more than a couple of words, to sum up your thoughts on how you would describe game design in Aotearoa. Now, I should probably give you like half an hour to think about that, shouldn't I?
Yeah.
Is anyone willing to go first?
I mean, I've got a glib one to go first.
Sweet as.
Sweet as. Hashtag lockdown no cons.
Okay, this may be the global state of role-playing game design. Yeah. Okay. Jamie, I should point out, is based in Auckland, or Tamaki Makaurau, in the North Island of Aotearoa, and Auckland has been in lockdown for what now, 60, 65, 68 days.
Third month, yeah.
Right.
Since August.
Yeah. And Cam, you're there too, of course.
I'm on the North Shore where we have huge parties of influencers.
Yes, illegal parties.
You're having a great time.
I mean, you know, who cares about rules and stuff, right?
So speaking of illegal parties by young influencers in Auckland, have you got a hashtag for us, Cam?
I would say hashtag online wake-up call would be what I would sort of do. I think that everything that changed for New Zealand's designers once we got more plugged into the global market and global sort of audience. Because when I left in New Zealand, we just were playing whatever we got from the States, from UK, you know, and the colleges and universities were pretty much playing freeform games. You know, like America here in Auckland was just like, well, I'll roll a dice once in a while, or I'll play D&D, you know, and it wasn't really anything. Nothing. It was all structured. Now I think that because we've got this attachment to the internet, we've got places we can sell, people we can sell to, we can write and share ideas and talk about this stuff. Yeah, it's an online wake up. I think what we haven't done is brought the world back to us yet, right? So we're sort of playing, we're guest starring in the world, but we're not really part of it. They're not part of us at this point.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, which we will come back to very shortly, I think. So, Michael, have you got a glib answer?
I do. And it's kind of the other side of Cam's. It's actually, I think it would be distant island. I really feel like, the fact we are so far away from everywhere impacts quite a lot of what happens here. And it's for many of the same things Cam was saying, our game shops don't have a huge selection. We're kind of stuck with what we can find there. There's a lot of like having to do our own thing. And also from a designer's perspective, there's the fact that it's hard to get people to know about what you're doing when the only way you can do it is via social media or contacting them online. We don't get to go to the big cons very often, if at all, in Europe and North America. Obviously no one can go to them at the moment, but pre-pandemic as well, it was very, very difficult.
Not to mention the horrendous shipping fees if you want to get something off Kickstarter or.
Oh yeah, that's always fun.
Or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's an issue that's just getting worse and worse right now. In the last several years, it's felt like international shipping has been gradually eroding at precisely the time when everyone was connecting up through the internet. But the last 2 years have been absolutely intense with that, and it really is falling apart right now, to the point where the US Postal Service announced that they were no longer going to actually ship to New Zealand, full stop. So we're now reliant on all sorts of other systems. But it strikes me that all of us have been playing role-playing games in Aotearoa for long enough that we can remember what it was like before the internet at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly Mike and Cam and I guess, have been playing since the very early days, the late 70s or the early 80s. And Jamie, I guess you come in the 90s with all those White Wolf games?
Yeah, I'd say about like 1994, 95.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right,
at that stage, it felt like the landscape was very different to me.
Oh, huge.
So Cam, you've already kind of implied that things have changed over that time. Do you want to say a little more about how you see that change over the last 40 years in a broader sense?
I feel that one thing that's definitely different is that because you can get things digitally, you don't have to face the material costs of a lot of this content, and you can enjoy and play games as long as you don't mind having them as a PDF or some other digital format, right? Ebook or something. When we were younger, we were kind of like at the mercy of whatever the game stores could bring in. So for a while prior to me working at Mark One, I would walk in there and I'd just look and see what was there. I mean, I bought a copy of Vampire when it first came out in the softcover version of it, right? And no one else bought it for like 3 weeks. It was sitting on the shelf. I'm like, well, no one knew what to do with it. There was no, and these days now there's like, social media, there's a marketing company behind everything. There was no idea what it was. There was no free quick start. There wasn't anything. It was like, hey, here's a book with a marble green cover. It's got a rose on it. Do you like Anne Rice? Probably you'll like this. That's the big difference, I think, is that even now, the idea that we would ever put something on a shelf and say, go on, pick it up, is ridiculous. And no one would put that on the shelf anyway, right?
And Mike, I feel like you're, when you did Monster of the Week, that was during the time when the internet had changed things. So
yeah.
Do you feel that having access to a wider range of work, a wider range of games through the internet, and having a better sense of what's happening in the game design scene overseas through the internet, do you think that changed the kind of games that we started to play and create in New Zealand?
Definitely. I mean, I know I was involved in both Ron Edwards' Forge website and later story games and all the kind of stuff that was happening on there online. And I know a few other people around were as well. So that kind of attitude, particularly the Forge's attitude of, anyone can actually sit down and design a game. You just have to do it and try it out. And there are, you don't have to publish it in a particular way. You can do what you want with that as well. was very, very influential for me. And like I say, I think a few other people who I knew in Wellington, at least, were also paying attention to that sort of online scene. So yeah, and it was definitely, and that was also the rise of the PDF option for publishing too. The 2000s, it was starting to be a thing of, oh, you don't have to print a book. You can just release something on the web that people can use. So yeah, that was definitely a big thing for me. Yeah.
And Jamie, did you? I mean, you were playing before the internet appeared,
Yeah.
and then at a certain point you started making stuff as well. And so what was that transition for you? What was it that sparked that?
I was actually thinking about that while Mike was talking, so it's good that you asked that particular question. I was thinking that for me it was that going to CapCon, which is Wellington's big gaming convention, lots of cool people there. I remember playing with Steve Hickey, who's just released Soth on Kickstarter. People like that, and everyone was obviously everyone was creating their own scenarios, but lots of people were doing homebrew systems at the same time. There we go. There's Soth. Bit of free advertising for Steve.
It's very cool.
And the idea that if there wasn't a game that did what I wanted it to do, I could just kind of write it myself, and it didn't have to have pages and pages of tables or random encounters or anything like that. I could just go. Actually, I think the first one I wrote was a Jane Austen game, so I was like, okay, let's recreate the idea of being in Pride and Prejudice and the entire point of it. Oh, and in fact, that one was based off a PDF game that I got online called Wuthering Heights, where you recreate this gothic horror romance thing. Let's just have some fun. So that's how I started. And then I, after a while, made some things that people actually liked, which was fantastic. And then, I've only ever published online.
And if I can jump in on that, I think also CapCon in Wellington in particular has been a real kind of hothouse for game design. Certainly starting in the late 90s, there's a real tradition there of people like homebrewing systems for their con game. And I think that grew into quite an active game design scene in Wellington in particular, with myself and Jamie and people like Steve Hickey, Simon Carrier, Morgan Davey, Dale LV, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a few other. Well, he was in Christchurch at that time, but he did come.
He'd come up for CapCon,
so yeah,
right?
So we're talking about Hamish Cameron, author of The Sprawl. There, by the way,
who'll be on the next panel.
Who was adjacent to the CapCon scene.
Yeah.
Because
Dale?
I intended to mention Dale. Yeah, but yeah, and I think that kind of homebrew for the convention games definitely led to a lot of things happening, and I think particularly Christchurch and the Saga Gaming Club down there seem to have a very similar sort of culture as well. So I'm not sure which one influenced each other, but they've certainly got a similar kind of thing going on there, I think. I'm not sure how much it's spread. Oh, sorry.
No, carry on.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm not sure how much what the situation in Auckland or Hamilton or Dunedin or any of the other cities are, but kind of Wellington and Christchurch are where.
Not been terribly good at getting to Auckland Convention since I moved up here, but it does seem to be a lot of D&D on offer.
And Cam, sorry, I was going to throw that to Cam actually and say that you have. I mean, you were involved in gaming in the 1980s in Auckland. Were you aware of game design happening? You said that what you will remember was in groups like America, which was the main role-playing group at Auckland University, which I think what did that stand for? It's an acronym.
Yeah, it was really bad. I mean, it's like everything else in universities back then, and probably still to this day. So much tongue-in-cheek stuff and other nonsense, I think that what might have been happening at that time was the genesis of what happened that Mike was talking about, which once we started having online forums, people who were sort of saying, I kind of don't want to go out and spend a whole bunch of money on these mainstream games, also because the stores aren't bringing them in, also because Where We're Living doesn't have a store anymore because the owners went bankrupt or something. So in the absence of that, and sort of fueled by these college, university kind of groups and other small groups, I think people's friend networks kind of helped spring that off. You'd go somewhere and you'd meet people, and they become your mates, and then those people would become part of a larger group, and then you'd all sort of say, well, we should play a game now. And at the conventions, and especially up here in Auckland, what it was like was, if you weren't running D&D or whatever was like the most popular thing at the time, it might be Shadowrun or World of Darkness stuff, you'd go to some other person's table, and they'd just be, the only reason they had any rules was to sort of like kind of keep things in structure, but the rest of it was like, here's your character sheet. You're a greengrocer and you've got 3 dogs in your house and you don't know what to do with your life, and you'd just be doing sit-down laps is what I would call it, right? And we'd already had Mind's Eye Theatre and vampires sort of exposure to the Wood of LARP, and we'd all be dressing up as vampires and whatnot. But I think that kind of absence of anything that people wanted to either can get afford to buy didn't really meet what they wanted. And then also kind of then suddenly, oh my gosh, there's like Usenet, and then there's like forums, and then there's bulletin board stuff. It became a huge thing where you could reach out and connect, right? Which led to what Mike's talking about. So I don't think there was anything really in terms of like professional game design going on. The only game that I knew about prior to that point was probably Goblins, and I'm now totally spacing on who that was again, but
I can tell you.
Yeah, well, good. I had a copy of that game at Waikato. I went to Waikato University. I had a copy of that game at Waikato passed around, and we were like, what is this weird thing? It was gruesome and strange and just perverse, and it was totally different. And when years later it became a GURPS thing, and we were like, oh, it's a shame,
Yeah, Goblins was Goblins was a role-playing game designed by 2 friends of mine, actually. So Malcolm Dale and Claude Thomas. And I played games with them a lot in the 80s, and then I still play games with Morgan today. He's still based in Auckland. Claude is overseas. So Goblins was a very strange, and to me, it was a game really ahead of its time.
Yeah.
It felt very much like the kind of game that might have come out in the early 2000s. But it came out in the early 90s, I guess.
Yeah, 1991. No, yeah, 89 maybe. Yeah, that's when I was at university, and I think we didn't know what to do with it at the time. Like, the first reaction was, "You can't do this. You're New Zealanders. Who made this? This isn't real." Which is a really kind of weird thing to say as a response, but there just wasn't anything like it, and I think that's the heart of it, really.
Yeah, it was subsequently recast as a GURPS supplement, which is it's still great fun, but it's the original is my favorite version. But I should mention that Malcolm's actually about to release a new role-playing game called Mayfly, which I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning that. So he's still creating stuff quietly in the background. But Jamie, you mentioned that the Auckland scene at the moment feels quite. It feels a lot more people just playing D&D. And I wanted to sort of bring it back to what Cam has mentioned a couple of times, which is in those early days, it felt like if people were doing something close to game design, if they were not wanting to play D&D or whatever the game was, they essentially played freeform. And that is what I remember too, that if we wanted to play something more sophisticated and complex, we would just abandon system entirely, effectively. We'd normally have a system in the background, but we just wouldn't be using it. And I feel like that's been a huge shift, is that in the last 20 years, people have said, no, if we're going to put system at the heart of creating more sophisticated, complex adult gaming experiences. And I think, Jamie, your work really speaks to that. So do you feel, how do you see that kind of shift happening?
Yeah, it's hard to say because most of the people I'm connected to up here are LARPers rather than tabletop gamers. So there is a lot of interesting stuff happening in campaign LARPs and in one-off LARPs, that kind of thing. And that is always freeform. There is never, there's no GURPS for LARP. The person who's running it is going to build their own structure, their own rules. I'm in a Regency era LARP. I mentioned Jane Austen before. And there's no rules for fighting, because it's not about that. It's about sniping at each other, having cups of tea. So there's a lot of that going on. Then the conventions that I've seen, and it's actually really hard to find access to them. So you have to sort of already know about them before you can find them, in my experience. Does seem to be quite kind of wargaming, D&D. Yeah. And then I'm lucky enough to be connected to gamers up here who are interested in story games and experimental stuff like myself. So played a lot of stuff off Kickstarter. My favorite game from this year, I can't see my copy of it, is Alice is Missing, which, if you don't know it, it's played entirely silently over text. But it's I don't know if I've got the whole view, but from where I'm sitting, there's a lot going on, but it's in little pockets. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that question of how the role of system has kind of shifted? I mean, Mike, it seems very, given your involvement in the Forge, and so
I think it seems to me that particularly with that homebrew culture of people with a vision for a particular game, doing a stripped down or almost non-existent system's an easy way to get started. And I suspect that's part of why it became popular. I mean, myself, I've always tinkered with systems as well. I mean, I've certainly done a few very rules light things, but I've also, I think one of my first big game design projects I did for myself when I was about 18 or 19 was basically making some insanely complex thing that could cope with anything, like GURPS, but much more so, before I'd even come across GURPS. Yeah, which not unfortunately that game is lost forever now. So
I'm hanging out for the Kickstarter, Mike.
I'd like to jump back on something Jamie said though, because about the LARP scene. Because I think certainly in Wellington, the LARP scene and the Capcom and tabletop role-playing game have been very much in parallel with quite a lot of overlap. So I think that a lot of the things that happen in one were influencing the other there too.
Definitely.
Yeah. I want to suggest something too. I think that the sort of rise of D&D again as a phenomenon worldwide came to New Zealand shores too, just in terms of having the exposure to things like Critical Role and other kinds of stuff. And D&D was, but I think that a lot of the new gamers here didn't actually belong to the gaming culture that was here prior to that, or if they were, it was when they were much younger, and then they're telling their kids, when I was a kid, I played D&D. You could play D&D. It's on TV now, They kind of missed the entire... It's like almost... I went away to the US, and then so did a whole bunch of this sort of phenomenon in a way, and I came back, and then suddenly everything in the US is sort of starting to flood back in, but the people who are taking it and making something of it aren't the people who are here right now. And I think that's sort of the sad part about it. We haven't got that experience that Mike and Jamie have of living here, living through the conventions, living through this sort of experience without that huge, jab in the sort of, what do you call that, the adrenaline shot that D&D is now bringing to this tabletop hobby.
Yeah.
Right. Now we've got a couple of questions have come through on the Twitch that I think are really interesting. The first one, I'm going to slightly adapt. What they were asking about was what people think of how much cross-cultural exchange of design traditions there is between Aotearoa and Australia. And feel free to broaden that question a little as well and talk about what influences from overseas in general come in, because I feel like the UK traditions had a big influence on New Zealand, not just the US scene. But particularly Australia, if anyone can speak to that.
I've known there's a few connections between kind of the Australian convention scene and the New Zealand convention scene. We've definitely had people visiting in both directions and that sort of thing. I'm not sure there's much explicit like game design crossover that I'm aware of, though.
Interestingly, I think that one of the things we've benefited from about Australia's game sort of hobby as it is now is it's becoming a place where Kickstarter fulfillment can be more cheaply aimed at, right? So almost everything I get now from Kickstarter has come in through Ether or someone else like there in Australia. It hasn't come from the UK directly or the US because it's ridiculous. So there's clearly a market there to support it. There isn't one like that Australia has here yet. So we're kind of being almost shoehorned into Australia as a group of in terms of that kind of market. But I don't know anything about Australia's game design scene at all, for example.
And I think that's quite striking, and I see that in comics and as well, that the connection, everyone outside of Oceania, of the South Pacific, assumes that Australia and New Zealand are essentially just one country, and we all kind of, are all involved in the same things. But in practice, maybe New Zealand, I almost feel like New Zealanders often try to keep Australia slightly at arm's length when it comes to their own creative communities.
Unsurprisingly, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit the Canada-US thing. We're the small country. But I'll jump to another couple of questions. Someone's asking, are there active Māori game design spaces, and how does the country's history influence the narratives played at the table? Now, this is a very big question, and I'll just start by saying, wait for the following panel as well, everyone who's watching this. So the panel that starts in the next hour is going to talk about role-playing games history and colonialism in the New Zealand context, and actually includes 3 local New Zealand Aotearoa game designers, Hamish Cameron, Toff Eklund, and Liam Stevens, who is a Māori game designer and is quite active in that space. But any thoughts anyone else has on that? Who wants to dive in?
I wish it was easier, because there should be a really active Māori game design space, but I'm not aware of it. So it's hard.
Some years ago, I was approached by White Wolf or Onyx Path, I guess, to do an entry in their Dark Eras anthology of settings for different White Wolf games. There was different White Wolf games as if they were reinvented at different parts of time, right? So a Victorian vampire or something else of werewolf. And they said, hey, Cam, you're from New Zealand. Do you want to do like a Geist the Sin Eaters, but set in the dream time? And I said, what are you, what? No, I don't know anything about that really. That's Australia. Also, I'm white. So there was a lot of discussion. I ended up doing God's Own Country, which was a really fun thing to do. But what it ended up being kind of was my sort of love letter to Ronald Hugh Morrison's books and Heavenly Creatures and things. So it wasn't even really from a Maori perspective, even though I had a whole lot of Maori cultural elements in it. I think it's dangerous in many ways, and this is obviously a conversation with the next panel, but I think we don't want to take on that responsibility as Pākehā, and you think that's the problem is we want to try and give that voice to others, but it's such a small community anyway, RPG designers, right? It's even smaller when you have to take Indigenous folks into it.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of strive to let the history here inform me, but I feel like it's not really my place to say anything about the Maori experience. It's
And I also want to mention that at our design school at Te Herenga Waka, we actually have a number of Māori students right now working on Māori role-playing game projects and other Māori gaming projects. I feel as though there's a generation at the moment emerging who are in their 20s for whom games, including particularly board games, really are a central part of their experience of narrative. And they're doing some really, really interesting work with it. So it may be that in a couple of years' time, there's a whole lot more coming out.
Actually, not just in that context, but I think that there is a new generation of designers coming out now. I know Dana Cameron has been helping host a kind of game designers meetup in Wellington for the past few years, which has been interrupted a lot by the pandemic, but that's got a lot of people coming in, and definitely, and in particular, a lot of younger people with quite different perspectives to those of us who've been doing this many years longer, which is great.
That's awesome.
Yeah, some wonderful stuff happening in that group. So another question, how did adaptable frameworks like GURPS or Apocalypse World, two very different examples there, GURPS and Apocalypse World, how did those impact New Zealand homebrew development? And I feel like we've already touched on that a little bit, but Mike, particularly, I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit about, and Jamie, actually, the impact of Apocalypse World.
Well, that's been big because both Monster of the Week and The Sprawl are Apocalypse World descendants from New Zealand authors, and I'm sure there are a few others that I can't bring to mind at the moment. But I think Apocalypse World and Dungeon World, when they came out, they made a big impact in the convention scene around here. A lot of people enjoyed playing them, so it definitely had a big effect. And Monster Hearts was also a huge hit.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of those got played at conventions I was at in the early 2010s. So definitely a big deal.
Popular this year.
Yeah. Other frameworks like GURPS, I haven't seen much done with here, but I think there's definitely people who are adapting existing frameworks rather than building things from scratch. But I'm not sure that's anything special here.
I do know that there's, for example, there are certainly OSR, old school role playing type. Who've done a whole ton of stuff, which all just sort of vaguely hangs off of D&D in their old school sense, but their actual content is largely, weird and sort of weird fantasy stuff and everything else. I mean, the movement there is interesting because it's similar to like Apocalypse World, where someone's got a game system that they can kind of hang their creative mind on, and so the most work that gets done isn't necessarily rules design; it's setting design and character approachability and the way your art looks. The aesthetic is a huge part of it, which I think is what some people really bring to the table now, as opposed to folks like me who still kind of occasionally go to spreadsheets to put numbers into it and figure out balance. Right.
Spreadsheets. I still use pieces of paper. Sorry,
that too.
Jamie.
I was going to say the accessibility is a huge part of it, and that's why it was popular at cons, because you could just pick it up and it just talks you through the character creation process, and you just immediately can see what it is that you can do and what the point of the character is, what your goals are. That definitely influenced how I write games, because it's so much fun. I wanted to harness some of that. I've not used the Apocalypse framework exactly, but it definitely had an influence.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you think, I mean, was it Michael, you said you felt that New Zealand hadn't yet brought the world to it. We haven't brought the world to our world and showed them that. So I wondered from each of you, what are the themes and styles and tones that you have both noticed turning up again and again in New Zealand gaming, but also what are the ones that you wish we would share with the world, the things that you wish you would see in our games that you don't really see?
I think we talked a bit about how we don't have a whole lot of really accurate or authentic Maori voices, but one thing that people maybe not realize is just how much of an Asian nation this is, and part of the whole Asian Circle, Pacific Basin. There's so many people here who are Asian who would love to play games that sort of speak to their own experience, and we kind of go, yeah, it's cool, but you're like the immigrants now, right? When we should be more welcoming and coming with that. I think bringing people into New Zealand, I would try to sort of, okay, forget Middle Earth and forget Lord of the Rings, and we love Peter Jackson, but really don't think about us as Middle Earth. Let's talk to you about the stuff that we actually have had happen here and what really is going on here in terms of our thematic sort of thing, being remote, but being also the sort of cast off of a colony in a way that's trying to detach itself from that.
For me, I see themes of a kind of what I associate with Vincent Ward's cinema, that kind of slightly gothic, rural, and uneasy sort of feel, which probably most viewers, that's not a very useful analogy, but that's definitely a theme in New Zealand film and literature, and I think it comes through in the games too. And in contrast to that, also the kind of deadpan and slightly absurdist humor that you see in things like Flight of the Conchords and What We Do in the Shadows, which I've definitely seen a lot of that in New Zealand games as well.
Wellington Paranormal is a reality show too, right? We have to tell everyone that's true.
I've recently, when I've been running Monster of the Week games, I tend to use the reality of Wellington Paranormal as a backdrop.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Right there waiting for you. Yeah, I don't know if I've got much to add because, I was thinking we've got this lush bush landscape. It's a rainforest, and it's always so close. Like, I live in Auckland, it's the biggest city, but I can drive 20 minutes and find native bush. And it's the sort of city, and up the road we've got a big park full of sheep right in the middle of the city. And it's this kind of landscape that I don't think is understood very well outside of New Zealand. I remember running a game, actually, of Monster of the Week at a convention, and I said, we're going to set it in America because that's a good shortcut for everyone. Yeah. And one of my American friends said, oh, you see, New Zealanders always think America's so cool, and that's why you set stuff there. And I'm like, no, it's just because we all know it. Like, we've all got this shorthand from media. We've all seen the movies. We've seen the TV. You don't have to think about it. You can just set it there. But when you think about setting stuff locally, you kind of want more to get it right and to be authentic and to bring in this atmosphere of being alone in the woods or out on the mountain and no one's seen you for 3 days, like in Vincent Ward movies or the classic New Zealand literature Man Alone. It's this isolation in our country, but also people within the country feeling isolated. Just go watch some terrible New Zealand movies, you'll understand.
Some good ones. But I mean,
In My Father's Den, that's the one I'm thinking of.
New Zealand literature and cinema, and I would stress Pākehā New Zealand, the history of Pākehā New Zealand, history and cinema. Pākehā being the tangata tiriti, the people who are not indigenous to New Zealand initially. That is often, there's often phrases thrown around like the cinema of unease, that it's that uneasy relationship that often Pākehā people feel with the landscape and the surroundings they're living in. And I think that's maybe more of a post-colonial feeling than we often like to admit to ourselves.
Oh, definitely.
Of course,
we're just setting it up for the next panel. Wow.
Exactly, which I have to say, the next panel, if you're watching this, please stay for the next panel because I am so excited about that panel. So we've got a few minutes left. I think we can get in one more question and then we'll do a sign out. There was a question from a viewer, which is, do you see Aotearoa authors and creators focusing now even more on online tools for creation to get around the distance issues? Now, we've touched on that quite a bit already, but I thought let's focus perhaps on Kickstarter and itch.io, which I see as two really crucial ways for New Zealand creators to distribute their work at the moment. I wonder if each of you might have a thought on the impact of those, but also if there's any particular Kickstarters that you have coming up or that you know of that are coming up that you want to mention. I know a bunch have just finished. If we'd done this a while ago, we could be plugging Morgan Davies' A State, for example.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
But yeah.
I think
my
Itch is really incredible because... Itch is incredible because it just seems like such a huge audience. Like I was publishing stuff on Drive-Thru-RPG, and you get like a week where they show you on the front page, or less if other people are publishing, and then you're kind of gone forever. Itch seems to be a lot easier for people to find you and move around. So that's kind of where I've gone now, is just using that format, and it's so easy. Like the interface is really lovely. So yeah, definitely for me, it's pretty much always going to be online. I think.
Yeah, and for me as well, because I'm also an ex-computer programmer, so I'm starting to think about more interactive tools for online play too, which definitely seems to be a wave of things that's happening anyway, and will definitely help get games out there in the future.
Yeah, the company I work for now, Fandom, we're doing a lot of stuff now, which is this is our first print thing. This is my book here, but the next game we're doing, Tales of Xadia, is going to launch with digital tools and a whole digital framework too. So it's like it's native for it as well. I think that's going to be where people will end up working. And there's nothing about what we do there that would actually help. That wouldn't be different or wouldn't be possible here. Like there's nothing that can be done in the US and UK right now that can't be possible here with the right tools and the right experience.
Yeah. And I'll just mention one of my thoughts is that the way so much play has shifted online, and people are now streaming games, and we're all watching streamed games and so on. In my experience, I've found that also slightly kind of dilutes the distinction between local and international. So I find myself playing a game online with people who are all over the world. And so the idea of these kind of little local micro cultures of gaming, it's becoming a much more complex idea, I think. And people are playing increasingly the way they see it played on the streamed games and so on. So we just about need to wrap up. I'll just mention before we do that that the conversation that we've started will continue on Discord if people want to join in there. There will be there'll be a special space on Discord to continue, a chat room on Discord dedicated to this panel. So if people want to join in, especially people from Aotearoa, feel free to jump in. And I just want to thank you all again. Jamie and Mike and Cam. We'll just go around one more time really quickly and remind people who you are and where they can find you online. So Cam.
Yep, I'm Cam Banks. You can find me at Boy Monster on Twitter, and I'm also starting to get an Instagram presence, which is a dumb thing to do when you're at my age, with Rusty Sellsword. So those are my two online handles.
North Shore influencers represent. Mike.
Yep. You can find me at genericgames.gen.nz. That's my personal website and has all the various social medias on there and game info. Yeah.
Sweet. And Jamie.
I'm Jamie. You can find me at jamiesands.blog. It's kind of got all the links on it, or Jamie Sands Books on Twitter. Again, you can just find me through there.
And if anyone needs to, they can find me at Dylan Horrocks. I have very, very boring online tags, and my website's hicksvillecomics.com. All right, so thank all of you so much for that really interesting conversation. And remember, everyone, there are a lot of other game designers in Aotearoa. Morgan Davey, Hamish Cameron, who you'll see in the next panel, Liam Stevens, Toff Eklund. There's a whole heap of stuff happening. Yeah, and find us online, please. That's where the rest of the world can find us.
I'll try and jump into the Discord.